Hello and welcome to our next session. I want to introduce Claire Wilgar to you. She is a front-end developer with a passion for accessibility. Claire is currently working at ESO Belfast and is a speaker at conferences and meetups and organises groups across the tech sector. We're going to hear Claire speak to us about hiring specialists for fun and profit, and just to kind of explain how the web development landscape is constantly expanding and changing in terms of stacks and technologies, and how much more is being done in the browser and complex the various modern web pages are. Just trying to keep on top of these, even just reading them out, can sometimes seem impossible. So I'll pass over to Claire. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Just make sure it stays in.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Claire, as mentioned. So a little bit about me, just to start. I'm a senior front-end developer at ESO Belfast. I've been there just over 2 years. I started out as a full-stack Java developer, so like way back when I sort of left uni and moved into the front-end as the first couple jobs. Nowadays, I particularly specialise in accessibility, so that like sort of niche within front-end development, which I will talk about later on in the talk, and a bit of user experience, not the design side, but just the sort of aspect that brings into front-end development. And you can find me as Claire Bones on like the NIDC Slack or Discord or whatever, everywhere except Twitter, because I have a different username there, but I don't think anyone's on there anymore anyway. So yeah, let me jump into it. I should sort of give the caveat that this is all very much from my perspective as a front-end developer. So like, I know everyone sort of has a different experience in the tech industry and everything else. And, yeah, just that sort of background caveat. So I'm going to start by going through the web dev ecosystem, like from the perspective of a front-end developer, what it looks like, what it's been like. Again, this is very much my experiences, so I'm going to talk about what have felt like sort of the main stages or points for myself in my career. I'm totally young and youthful, 30s, so there's obviously been stuff beforehand that I wasn't working in. You know, I'm not saying I've worked in the web since it existed or anything like that. So sort of the first thing, one of the first areas that I sort of started working in web dev was when the internet was still standalone web pages. So relatively simple pages, you know, you upload an individual file to a server somewhere, it has a bit of CSS, has a bit of JavaScript, a bunch of HTML. Not really fancy APIs or anything like that, like limited functionality. Very much like your informational pages. And I say social pages here, I don't mean like Bebo or even MySpace, never mind like Twitter and Facebook, but GeoCities in those days, you know, everyone making their own web page for their own little hobbies and interests. And that was kind of where I think a lot of people got started, like myself, in doing a little bit of web dev. And it was very much like, for a lot of us, vanilla HTML, a bit of CSS, a bit of JavaScript. There were Flash websites, certainly people that remember playing games online back then, you know, a lot of stuff in Flash. But things were very sort of individualized, like even if you had a website with a couple pages, they were just individual pages at a sort of shared URL. Sort of moving on from there, a couple of years later, moved into like the framework space. So I feel like at this point, we started to get to where websites did have like a separate API, and that's what people were, you know, your data was coming back and forward. It was a bit more interactive with data. It wasn't just like a pre-coded or pre-rendered on the server page that you just got delivered. There was data coming back and forward. There were extensions to CSS, so Sass and less, things like that, and build processes. So I think this is a place where a lot of people sort of dip their toes into front-end development and then turn around and ran away again, because like Gulp and Webpack and all these sort of what felt like very complicated build processes that you had to sort of do to get these sort of more framework-based apps off the ground. There were a lot of JavaScript frameworks back then. Sorry. So Bootstrap and jQuery are kind of the old school ones. I think a lot of people probably remember that have done any front-end development. And then Angular, React, Vue, things like that. So those are the ones that are kind of still around today that a lot of people probably have experience with if they've done any front-end development. Certainly not so much with Bootstrap and jQuery these days, although I know some people are still holding out on it. And these are very much sort of when the like single-page app concept came in. So the idea that you'd hit one URL and you could go and do multiple functionalities, multiple parts to the app, you know, loading dashboards or filling in forms and all these kind of things. So from there, we kind of go on to what I think of as like where we are now, certainly for a lot of us and what we're working on. So web applications are much more complex. There's a lot more to them, certainly in a lot of cases these days. They are considered a replacement for like a desktop app. So for example, you know, you would have had your Excel and your Word and your PowerPoint, you can do all of those in the browser. This is a slideshow that's in the browser, you know. Everything that we would have thought previously is like, oh, you would never do that in the browser or on the web, like we can now do because browsers are much more capable, but also our devices are more capable and our internet connections can handle a lot more. So like things like Netflix and streaming even, obviously we weren't doing that 20 years ago, but we can do that now. These kind of apps, they are a lot more complex, they do a lot more, they tend to have a lot of endpoints, so there's a lot of data moving back and forward and manipulating that data in the browser and everything else. And a big part of these is that they are core to a lot of people's jobs. So like I mentioned, Word and Excel, you know, a lot of people, certainly in Northern Ireland, make web apps that other people use in their day-to-day job. Like we make software for other people in our companies or in other companies to sit and use 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So there's a lot of complexity in that and a lot of responsibility in that and getting it right. So that kind of leads me on to best practices. This has obviously evolved as this, you know, time has moved on from where we started with standalone web pages. So accessibility is the main one, and anyone who's seen me talk before knows I tend to talk a lot about accessibility, so I'm not going to go on a way deep dive on that one today, but it's essential, like, as we talk about people using these applications for their job and their day-to-day work, if something's not accessible, then you're cutting out people from being able to use it, whether that's they can't book their holidays on the website or they literally can't sit and fill in the data they need to do their job, or they can't apply for their MOT or get their passport or anything else. And internationalisation is another big one. So most companies nowadays, generally, outside of like your tiny indie companies, or tiny small companies, they want to be able to expand. They want to work in multiple countries. They want to support people who speak multiple languages, not just like the main first language of the people that work in the company. So internationalisation is also a big one that has a lot of complexity. There's a lot of better and worse ways to do it. Performance again, so performance has kind of always been a concern, but as we get bigger frameworks, gigantic amounts of images and of JavaScript and everything else, and never mind like the amount of data that we're pulling into our pages every day on our browsers and on our own internet connections like that we're paying for, that it becomes more and more important because we have, you know, we can really make or break someone's experience on a website based on how much we consider the performance. And this one also kind of does go back to, like, if people use your website and it's not performant, they're just going to stop using it. If I tried to use Netflix and every time it took 10 seconds before I could start playing, then I would just move somewhere else. I wouldn't use it anymore. And responsiveness is kind of linked into this as well. So with responsiveness, you know, we talked about different devices. People are using different devices, different machines. In the olden days of when I started, everyone was sitting in front of an 800 by 600 CRT. So you were reasonably sure that everybody was looking at the same thing as you were whenever they looked at the web page that you'd built. But nowadays that's different. Everyone's got different sizes of phones and tablets and wide screens and ultra wides for their gaming and laptops. You know, you have to be much more conscious and aware of what people might be experiencing that's not exactly the same as what you're seeing when you look at the website. And then security. So security, obviously, as you can tell by the fact that there's talks entirely on security here today, like, security is a much bigger thing than I can even get into, but it's such a crucial part of best practices in front-end web as well as every other part of modern, like, tech industry, there's so much that you have to consider that can really make or break your app and even your company if you don't get it right. So all this to say, basically, there's a lot of detail and a lot of nuance and a lot of things that require a lot of consideration if you're building modern front-end websites and web apps. And there are obviously other areas of specialization, so operations and DevOps, in some companies these are the same, some companies these are different. Same as your SDETs and your test engineers, from manual testing to writing automated tests and that sort of thing. Security, again, a lot of the times an entire department right up to the C-suite dedicated to security in a modern company. And people like database architects. Now obviously this isn't an exhaustive list of specialists, it's just to highlight that we've sort of moved on in a lot of cases from the webmaster days where there was one guy in a cupboard somewhere that was writing your whole website and managing your whole online presence for what that meant back then. There is a lot more to it, and some of these are very commonly recognized in companies as being a specialism on their own. Some of them not so much. Like some companies, your devs will also manage all the DevOps and the deployments and the pipelines, whereas in others, you'll have a dedicated team and a dedicated group of people to do that. So moving on slightly to my experience and sort of why I'm here today talking about this. When I started my career, obviously I was part of a team. I was, very junior and getting my head around everything. Started off in Java, learned from people that were more senior than me, that knew a lot more than I did, and through that I sort of figured out what I wanted to target my career on. I didn't want to just kind of do a little bit of everything, because there were certain things that really interested me and that I had a lot of passion for, and it made sense for me to target my career to go specifically into front end to fit that. And so now, after a fair number of years, I'll not say how many, I am at a place of being the most senior front-end developer in my team, in my project, and in our office and work. And that does come with, responsibilities and requirements. Where I am now, I'm working on a component library as well as a main application. And that comes with complications because with the component library, there's obviously the consideration of every other team is using your app. So you can't just kind of say, well, I'll do an all right job and I'll come back to it later, because if my component that I build isn't accessible, then the app that the other teams have built that use my component, they're not accessible either. If my thing's not performant, their apps aren't performant. So you don't just want to have a component library that's good enough. You want to have it that is pretty good, because other teams are relying on that. And then beside that, I also work on a main application outside of that component library, which uses that component library. And that app is something that people use to do their jobs. It's a dedicated role in a company to, in my case in a hospital, to use this piece of software every day to do their jobs. The job doesn't exist without the software and vice versa. So we have to get that right, because if we don't get that right, then that's, there's a whole chain of impacts on the people that do that job, onto the people that need the results of that job, the data, which has an impact onto the patients, and on and on. So there's a lot of guidance that I want to give as the more experienced front-end developer to make sure we do those things right. And a big part of that is encouraging front-end best practices and encouraging people to invest in their front end of their apps. Not just okay, well, we have a great API and I guess we need probably some HTML at some point so somebody can see it. You want people to be dedicated to doing it right and doing it well. So a common team structure that I see and that I have, been in teams like this before is the everyone is full stack approach, where everyone kind of comes in a similar level and everyone kind of does a bit of everything. Teams like this can be often mid-level heavy, although you're obviously going to have some seniors, some juniors. Sometimes that's not exactly the balance, but it's reasonably common. And what you get whenever you have a team where everyone's full stack is that everybody can pick up whatever ticket, just whatever's next, whatever's priority. Anyone can pick that up. the decisions are made by often the whole team, because no matter what the decision is, everybody has an equal or roughly equal amount of knowledge and experience in any given area. So there's no reason not to have everybody having some input. Obviously, caveat is sometimes in some companies that decision is made by somebody that doesn't even talk to the team and is way up higher, but that's kind of a company structure thing. And in these teams, you'll have QA, ops, design people. They might be in the middle of your team, or they might be separate. Some companies, you'll have a dedicated QA team that take the work from the devs and then pass it back. A dedicated ops team that aren't embedded, same with design. Or you might have the opposite. You might have that every team has a design person and every team has a QA person, or multiple people kind of picking up that work. Which means that those areas are getting the specialism and the sort of dedicated people in the room that, in the meetings and on the tickets that sort of know the intricate details. But whenever you have a team where everyone's full stack, sometimes that can mean that the best practices for front end can be a secondary concern. And I think this comes from partly a sort of just lack of experience if people haven't done a lot of front end, but also I do find that a lot of people that haven't done front end have a lot of fear of front end. It's quite scary to people that don't do it all the time. So they'll kind of prioritize, I'll let someone else do the front end thing and I'll just kind of get it working and work on the back end, and then hopefully someone else will pick up the front end part. So, sorry. The benefits of hiring a specialist, particularly if you're in a place like that or a team like that, you're going to get more specific experience. So using myself as the example for being a front-end specialist, I potentially have, more experience in a bunch of things that people might avoid or just have not had to do. So upgrading a version of a framework or of Angular, or a certain security concern that comes in, or things like that. If somebody is a specialist in a certain area, they're probably going to have seen that before and done that specific thing before, more so than people that have been working on a large breadth of things. They're less likely to have exactly the experiences that your team needs. Also, I think, at least in my experience, the more I sort of work as a front-end specialist, the more I've seen front-end things go terribly wrong. I think this partly comes from being a senior in anything. The longer you've worked in the industry in general, the more you see companies make a decision and terribly regret it 6 months later. But it definitely helps to have, if you're a specialist, you've probably been right in the deep end of that problem. If we had a massive problem with our front end tomorrow, our full stack people might not be right in the middle of that. They'd be on the edges, just helping out where they can. Whereas the people that specialize in that area, whether it's security, front end, whatever, are going to be the ones right in the middle of it. You also get with a specialist somebody who is more focused on an in-depth knowledge of that area. So like I mentioned before with all those best practices, it's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff just in front end. There are people that specialize in just parts of that list of best practices. There's a whole debate at the minute about whether front end should actually be two sort of disciplines by itself, which is front of the front end and back of the front end, which is the sort of CSS and visual versus the functionality. So you're getting someone that's a lot more focused on that particular thing rather than being kind of a bit good at everything, but not really in depth. And then as a specialist, they're also going to be making more of a point of keeping on top of changes and best practices. An example of this would be last week there was an update to what's called the WCAG guidelines for accessibility. So that comes out and it's a whole new set of standards and guidelines that we and any company that follows it needs to make sure that we're up to date with those standards. If I'm a front-end specialist, then it makes sense that it's part of my role and part of my interests to know that, top to bottom, really research it, really get into depth with it. But it would be too much to expect somebody to do that for every aspect of everything that goes into your app, everything that comes out, every change to .NET, every change to Azure or S3 or anything else. And also if you have a specialist, they can be there to guide and to mentor people that are not so specialized. So some people don't want to specialize, and that makes sense. I don't think every person on a team wants or needs to be a specialist. But it means that if you have a team where most folks are more full stack and not specialized, then you just need a handful of specialists that can sort of jump in and point them in the right direction, or be a point for them to ask questions or to get a better understanding of a certain area, and maybe catch them before they make a terrible mistake that they wouldn't have known about because they just don't have the same in-depth knowledge or experience that you do. So this obviously would have an impact to your company or your team, to bring in a specialist and move away from that sort of full stack only approach. It would change the distribution of work, and some people will see this as a downside. It sort of depends, I think, on how you arrange your work. So yes, it does mean that a specialist is not going to just pick up every ticket. Like, aside from anything else, nobody wants me to pick up .NET or Python tickets. I'm not going to say I would do a good job doing them. So that will change things, because it means you can't just hand every ticket off to the next person, but it does mean that whenever they do that work, it's going to be potentially stronger, and it's going to be more useful as setting a standard and setting a guideline that the rest of the team can then follow. Say, for example, you're doing the first page of a new piece of functionality, or a new way of approaching a particular problem in your team. The specialist does that one time. That doesn't mean they have to do all the front-end tickets forever, but it means that there's now a standard set that everyone else can follow, and a pattern that makes it easier for the rest of the team, which is that strong guidance. It is that, like, pointing the team in the right direction. And it means whenever you have those hard decisions to make, like, we need a library to handle dates and times. Well, from my experience, I know the common libraries are gigantic, and most of the time you're not going to need most of what they do. So let's not make that decision, because we care about performance. And also, we'll know maybe the security team don't want us to bring in a library that does way more than what we absolutely need to do. And sometimes I think if the whole team is making the decision together and there's no particular expert or in-depth knowledge, you can get that, like, too many cooks problem. Everybody has an opinion, and it ends up just being the person that shouted the loudest that gets, their way, even if that person didn't necessarily know more than anyone else in the room. It also provides more confidence. So for your less experienced team members, just having somebody there that has that experience and that specialization can make them feel like they can try something because they know that you'll catch it, or they can do something and try it out and get you to point them in the right direction, or mentor them, like one-to-one coding, pair programming, things like that, because they know there's somebody there. So that specialist isn't going to let things go too far wrong compared to if there was no expert. Sometimes teams will stick to what's safe and what feels like what we've done before, because there's no risk. And part of this is, like, this decision comes down to what way your team and your company structure works. So you might have specialists that are embedded in your teams. So, like we talked about with QA and design and things like that, you might have a whole bunch of front-end people in a particular team, and maybe that's permanent, or maybe that's temporary because that team really needs help at that given time. Or you might have standalone specialists, so things like your architects, where they work for the company, but they basically jump in and out of whichever team needs guidance and needs that input. Like a team is rolling up a new app, that's when they need an architect, but they don't need an architect probably the week before they go live, because it's kind of too late to make those, and that specialist will have moved on to another team by then to help them. So, in conclusion, I think very few people can be experts in everything. And I don't mean nobody, because I've absolutely worked with people that feel like they're an expert in everything that they try, and just somehow don't struggle with anything and find everything very easy to understand and also very interesting. But even if somebody finds something very interesting, there's just such a big scope, such a big amount of knowledge to have that, where would you even find the time? You would have to not sleep to be on top of every new change that comes out for your back end, your front end, your QA approaches, your DevOps approaches, all of that at once. I think if you're a small team, a new team, you're like starting up a new company or run a POC of a new project, maybe then that's not the time for you to have a specialist brought into your team, because you're just kind of moving fast. You're not so worried about best practices. Like I'm saying this in the ideal world where we all do our POCs and then throw them out and start fresh whenever we're ready to build. And I know that doesn't always happen, but in theory. So at those points, if you're a new company and you're like, we have 2 devs, you're not going to worry about getting two specialists at that point. You just need 2 people that can do a reasonable amount of everything to get something out the door and get the ball rolling. But when you start to get to a bigger team and a bigger size, and maybe you're getting bigger products or bigger customers, or maybe you're starting to find that because of the products that you're making, you have certain requirements, legal requirements, accessibility requirements, things like that, or even just things where you need to compete with other companies, where that's where you'll probably want to start and bring specialists in. Or if you're doing something where you know that there's a particular risk or a particular sort of fear among your team of doing a certain thing or taking a certain approach. One thing that I've joined in teams is, Angular upgrades, is framework upgrades. It is a scary thing for a lot of folks, and a lot of teams will feel a lot better about having someone who's done that before and done it a bunch of times, rather than people that aren't really even front-end developers, sort of guessing and hoping that they're taking the right approach to it. So, yeah, I think just basically the conclusion of the conclusion is this isn't a catch-all. Everyone should have specialists on every team from day one. This is just, as your team grows and depending on your needs, I personally find having specialists and people that have in-depth knowledge and experience in a certain area will be a huge benefit to a team compared to having an entirely full-stack team where there's the lack of experience and sometimes the lack of confidence to go into certain areas in depth. So yeah, that's me. Hopefully that made sense. And there's time for questions if anybody wants them.